Hi everyone, I'm Chris O'Neill from Sew the Distance. Thank you for joining me today. So today we're going to look at an old quilt, and this particular quilt was found during our move. Some of you may not know, but we recently moved from Massachusetts to Pennsylvania, and when we were cleaning out our 27 years of junk in a garage, I found this quilt at the bottom of a cardboard box. It kind of broke my heart. I know it had to have been there at least 25 years because I started quilting about 24 years ago, and I never in a million years would have put a quilt in a cardboard box in the garage after I started quilting and really understood the value of it. Making this worse is I know my grandmother made this quilt and she isn't with us any longer, so I treasure this quilt because she made it, and I am heartsick because it was in a cardboard box. While it was in a cardboard box, a mouse or some other rodent had found it and right in the middle had chewed a hole in this quilt. So making it the whole experience even worse, and just breaks my heart. But we can still learn from my grandmother, and we can still learn from this quilt. So let's take a closer look, see what we can learn, and just look at what my grandmother made. At first glance, you can see that it is a scrap quilt, and it's really well done. I think, and again, I wish I could ask her, but the pieces are put together in 4 patches, and you can tell that because of the matching fabrics in each of those. So she took a bunch of 4 patches and put them together into this very random configuration, but it works. It's really a pretty quilt, and it's pleasing to the eye to look at. You can just tell that it's scrappy and wonderful. The next thing you notice is the ties, which this is yarn, and she wasn't super consistent about putting them at every corner. I'm not quite sure why, and maybe they just fell out, but there are some spots you can see here that do not have ties. The majority are tied, but not all. Maybe she ran out of yarn. I'm not quite sure what happened there. It is hand pieced, which is interesting because I know she sewed on the machine, but she also enjoyed handwork. She crocheted and she would knit as well. So maybe that's why she decided to do this by hand. When we look at the binding or the finishing, you'll see that she did use a machine for that, and we'll look at that in a moment. But first I want to show you the hole that our lovely mouse decided to chew in the middle here. And you can see there's some staining around it, probably because I used some different chemicals to treat it before I washed it to make sure that there were no leftovers from the mouse in this. And of course the mouse chose the exact center of the quilt, the prime real estate to gnaw from, which is wonderful, isn't it? So if this mouse would have chosen an edge, I could do a lot more with it to repair it, but unfortunately here in the middle is where the mouse chose to chew on it. I'm not sure how I'm going to recover this. Right now, just looking at it, I think I'm going to make some baby quilts for possible future grandchildren, her great-grandchildren. I'm not sure. I could also make some throw pillows or something like that, or even just a smaller quilt, but I don't know. Stay tuned. I will be working on that, trying to recover this quilt. There are a few other spots where the mouse decided to chew, but the big one is right here. Let's take a look at the back of this quilt and also the finishing, because the finishing is very creative, and if we can learn anything from my grandmother on this quilt, it would be that. Okay, so the first thing I want to show you is that she used a sheet. She used a sheet on most of her quilts that she made. I have a few that she made me. I have a few that did not end up in a box in the garage that I treasure, and I will be showing them in the next couple months, but she always used a sheet for the backings. And it's an economical way to finish a quilt to use on a backing of a quilt. It's the size that you would need, like if you're going to do a twin size quilt, you get a twin size sheet, which is kind of cool too. However, people who are critics of this technique say that it's too tight of a weave to quilt through, and that the shrinkage of the whole thing wouldn't be consistent. I've never used a sheet on the back of a quilt, But you know, I think I'm gonna try it because I really want to form my own opinion about that. If you've ever used a sheet, please let me know. I'd love to hear from you about that. But the finishing, so she put this pretty lace around the outside and she did top stitch it to the front of the quilt. Before she did that though, she folded over her quilt top to encase the sheet and then hand stitched that down. So it's almost like a facing, except for she used part of the quilt front to do the facing. Usually what you do with a facing is you would stitch on this side, on the edge of the quilt, and you'd stitch your backing and then pull it around, and then you'd have an edge where it would be the quilt top and then the backing, part of the backing, and then stitch it down. However, she sacrificed some of the quilt top for this technique. I love that. What a great idea. You know, it doesn't take away from the quilt. If anything, it was a really easy and creative way to finish it. And if you're ever intimidated by finishing a quilt, hey, consider doing this because it looks really neat. The corners, here she mitered the corners on the back. And on the front for the lace, she just gathered and like almost did like a pin tuck. I think that's what it's called. Pin pleat, something like that, right here to pleat that and make it lay semi-flat and real roughly and pretty. You know, there you have it. This is a unique way of finishing a quilt, and I hope you enjoyed looking at this. There's so many lessons we can learn from this quilt, and probably the biggest one is how we store our quilts. Be careful putting them in any type of storage that would expose them to possible rodents using the contents for a fluffy nest. So just be careful with that, putting it in boxes or even putting quilts into, say, plastic bags or anything like that they could be thrown out. Just be very cautious about any of that. The next thing that I think is important to learn from this quilt is the finishing on it. My grandmother was extremely creative with how she finished this quilt, where she took the top and turned it under onto the back and put the sheet underneath and then sandwiched it under. What a great idea. And then to top stitch lace on it. It's a beautiful way to finish a quilt. And you know, we don't always have to do bindings or facings, or maybe we don't know how. Maybe you're new to quilting and that part intimidates you. Think outside the box. As long as you enclose everything as best as to your abilities, you know, it'll be fine even when it is washed. And trust me, this was washed with hot water and dried on high too to kill anything that might have been remaining in this particular quilt. And lastly, it's important to take any pieces like this, old quilts, maybe with a hole, instead of throwing them out, to take those quilts and to try to repurpose them. And in the next few weeks, I am going to take this quilt apart and cut it down and make some baby quilts for some future grandchildren. Well, thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned for more updates on other quilts and this quilt as I get settled into our house. I will have a vlog this Friday with an update on our whole house move-in experience. It wasn't exactly easy, and we're still kind of dealing with it, but hey, we'll get there. And I'll see you next week for yet another episode of Lessons from an Old Quilt. I'll see you soon. Bye.